Apostolic Majesty, thank you so much for joining me. And are you ready to face the Gauntlet?
I am indeed. I am trepidatious, but I am ready. Let's do this.
That's the right attitude. So, for round one, do you want to talk about music? Do you want to talk about economics? Or would you like to talk about cosmology?
Oh, well, I'm probably going to fail miserably on all topics. Let's start with economics. Let's go for the most boring one.
Sure. Oh, I don't know. If do you know my audience? They love economics. The privatization of healthcare leads to inefficiencies. Progressive taxation reduces inequality, or free markets inherently lead to unacceptable levels of inequality. And you, by the way, you can argue for or against any of these.
Hmm. Well, I'm not sure. Is inequality necessarily a bad thing? Is the
Oh
is the
well,
broad is the broader question I would ask.
I mean, the question uses the word unacceptable, so I don't know. You could choose to rephrase the question. I'll allow that.
No, no, no. It's fine. I mean, I look at these questions and there are so many sort of myriad things floating around in my
True.
head. I'm not quite sure how to tackle this
Yes,
because
quite.
whether I should apply some sort of moral argument or apply a sort of a strictly sort of a utilitarian
Hmm.
GDP style view, but
Hmm.
free markets inherently lead to unacceptable levels of inequality is clearly a moral a moral
Hmm.
point. You know,
Right.
what is an acceptable level of inequality? Indeed, you can say that there is no such thing as an acceptable level of inequality.
Right.
So I like that question.
That's good. Let's lock it in. Take it away.
All right. So free markets. Well, based on the idea essentially that there is any sort of private enterprise or any sort of ability to move goods from one area to another. Um, this is sort of the most basic element of economics, where the minute you have multiple people engaging in commerce, you don't all start out from the same position and end up at the same position, which would have to imply some sort of major amount of statist intervention in order to get to that position. So obviously, this leads to inequality. That is a very basic point. And as to whether that's acceptable or not, I think a fascinating thing about this is that I actually have a very sort of flippant view when it comes to economics. I mean, I'm not exactly enamored with the prospects of where the Marxists really want to get us, or where diversity, equity, and inclusion wants to get us. So
Hmm.
I would look at this question and say I really don't know whether you can apply that much in terms of moral arguments to economics, other than just looking at broader points relating to pure exploitation. And I don't mean that in the sense that there are structural inequalities, or to look at this in terms of sort of rigid class analysis or whatever, but to simply say, is one person deliberately going out of his way to screw over another person? Um, taking this on a sort of case by case individual basis. Um, but like I said, there are many ways you can read into that question. Is it a moral question or is it an economic question? So I would say that yes, free markets do inherently lead to inequality, and I would say whether there's sort of a moral application to that. I mean, I don't think there is, because, like I said, these are systemic questions rather than questions of individual cases. And I believe I could only answer a moral question when it comes to a case by case basis.
Well, I have to ask this, and I hope it's not too provocative for me to bring it up. But what do you make of some of the papal commentary on economics in recent years?
When it comes to things like distributism, I would need to become more versed in terms of the intricacies of distributism. But as far as I'm aware of it, and please, I'm sure there are many people listening to this who are far more sort of well versed in terms of the all the implications regarding distributism. But essentially, distributism is about allowing a basic level of economic autonomy, which is provided universally, the common right of dominion. Um, I think the general moral idea behind that essentially is that so long as there's, say, for example, economic autonomy within the family, there is some sort of basis from which, a foundation from which they are not completely dependent on a state actor who can be either benevolent or malevolent. And the corollary to that is also the idea of subsidiarity, whereby all, not just economic processes, but also church hierarchies, etc., are decentralized to a point where they are very much predicated on the local conditions, however they exist within any particular region. This sates my sort of interest in terms of a broader point relating to decentralization, that you shouldn't necessarily impose a very sort of centralized and I would say probably prejudiced in the most literal sense of the word, a one-size-fits-all economic program to be applied everywhere, which you can say, for example, is the impetus behind something like net zero. Net zero would probably be the absolute inverse of something like subsidiarity. So obviously that might inform my view as to the moral implications of that position.
And do you think that free markets have actually ever existed? And if not, then is this a fairly academic question?
Uh, it is a fairly academic question in the sense that how do we define free markets?
Well, yes.
You know, I like I said, I'm not an economist,
No.
so I'm not sure I'll be able to provide you with a textbook definition of what a free market
It almost
is.
seems
But
like a rhetorical phrase that politicians have used. It's kind of associated with laissez-faire and
well, we'll take an example I'm familiar with. Japan in the 16th century. Um, During that time, Japan was very decentralized, but as a consequence, uh, market goods and travel throughout Japan was actually incredibly difficult because you would have to keep flitting from one domain to another.
Hmm.
So one of the great unifiers of Japan, Oda Nobunaga, came in. He removed many of the internal customs barriers which prohibited trade. And in that sense, you can say he liberalized trade within Japan by making it more accessible, by allowing commerce to take place more freely. In the same way, you can take the Mongols and say, what is their, greatest sort of contribution to the art of empire building? You could say it's the extension of free trade, weirdly enough, allowing a process by which goods can be transported without unnecessary encumbrances from what is now Beijing all the way to what is now modern Moscow, which is an incredibly sort of ambitious endeavor. But also, if we're going to take the argument that there is a sort of amoral political aspect to it, free markets is also a way to ideologically justify the expansion of your state. And of course, that is the mantra behind the British Empire going into places like China, uh, bashing the door in and forcing you all essentially to become consumers. So the minute free markets become, you can say, a ideology or a sort of driving mantra behind some sort of political program rather than simply incidental as part of a program of prosperity, which you can say was the case in Japan or the Mongols, I think it can be a rather disastrous formula, as I believe it was the case with the British, and fundamentally leading us to the situation where we have now.
Wasn't it King Hammurabi and his Code of Hammurabi that standardized things in Babylon and actually led to a great deal of what you could call free trade, at least trade with fewer frictions. So you could trace it all the way back to, what was that, sort of a couple of millennia BC. You could go back that far and say,
Are you
actually,
not are you not
civilization
saying
depends.
are you not saying that free market's the result of Randian style free associations of people?
Well, it's a matter of degree, isn't it? And you could look at the EU imposing all kinds of seemingly arbitrary standardizations and regulations either as a free market or a non-free market force, depending on, you know, if it is the standardization that it allows trade to be easily, expanded worldwide. Actually, it is the regulation that frees the market, in a weird way.
Yes, but is free making something more accessible or
Hmm.
reducing state intervention? And
Hmm.
that would almost be a contradiction in terms, then, wouldn't it? Depending on your view.
Yes, it's like
Because you can say the European Union is an internal and expanding market, but I don't believe it's in any sense free, especially if you contrast it with tariffs when encountering other economic blocs.
Hmm. Good. Okay, let's bring that round to an end. And I think I'm going to give you a solid. I'm going to give you a solid 8 for round one. So you're off to a good
Oh, well,
start.
that's very flattering. So I wasn't exactly sure what precisely I was arguing for then.
Well, it's also you're not sure what the scoring system is, so it could be 8 out of 800 for all you know.
Yes, exactly.
All right, round two: ethics, history, metaphysics.
Ooh. I think I'm going to shock everyone and be incredibly subversive and go for metaphysics.
Maybe you need to start a new metaphysics channel. That's what the
Hmm.
world's been waiting for. All right, here are your 3 statements. Our experience of consciousness disproves materialism. Time is illusory, or cause and effect is real.
And looking at, this isn't the one I want to go for, but just a point. When I
Mhm.
think in cause and effect is real, I remember going to a A-level philosophy class and having to work out how Hume is able to deduce things from happening, whilst not being able to understand that anything can happen beyond the range of our senses. So coming up with these incredibly sort of outrageous theories as to how anything can happen if one isn't there to perceive it. But time is illusory is quite an interesting thing. But I don't know. I think I'm going to go for our experience of consciousness disproves materialism, and I would argue in favor of it.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, on the sort of most basic note, if you're going to go to sort of 17th century, I actually can't remember. I'm trying to sort of go through my philosophy notes right in my head right now and deduce whether Descartes was formerly Cartesian. But anyway, moving on from that. Um,
I mean, if anybody is, surely.
yes, but the pure skepticism sort of focuses on the idea of consciousness as being the foundation from which existence essentially stems, the thinking self, cogito ergo sum. And the logic there actually says that consciousness is the only thing that could be proven to exist, our sense of our own consciousness, our sentience, and that everything beyond that, all materialism, can be some form of apparition. They could be a form of deliberate deceit, but there is no sort of necessary formula within this system of advanced skepticism that any of these objects in and of themselves can have some sort of reality. Um,
So the really radical thing about materialism is not that it denies the existence of self, but that it radically believes in the existence of other.
yes, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. And if you look at materialistic philosophies, then the logic of materialism is actually to deny the individual thinking self. It reduces the individual to nothing more than a
Oh.
set of economic actors. And then you come up with theories such as the notion of bourgeois sanctity of life, as Trotsky would say, that human beings can be conditioned and changed on a whim, just like plant life and just like factory conditions and things like that. They're essentially interchangeable, denying the notion that sentience offers some form of exceptionalism. Um, and of course, take this sort of theistic argument and saying, does the consciousness in and of, the very nature of consciousness presuppose that there is a authority beyond us, which is transmaterialistic, either you can take a secular view and say this is the Platonic theory of forms, where there is a perfect sort of aspect of things such as aesthetics or metaphysics, ethics, etc., that can exist beyond the material. And of course, the theistic conception would be that these things necessarily belong to God or something like that. So there are many ways that you can say that this sort of disapproves a sort of pure materialism. And I think one of the most devastating things about a purely materialistic philosophy is that it simply is a way to justify absolute nihilism, including the disapproval of the self, the disapproval of all values, because it's very difficult to assign any sort of value in a material thing if you're denying the idea that values can exist independently of that thing. So how can you come up with things such as universal values? And that's what I find sort of ironic when talking about materialism, because materialist philosophies are in themselves appealing to universal uh, trans materialist values in order to justify materialism.
Yeah, there's so much in philosophy that's kind of self-defeating if you make these big claims. Although I do think there's kind ultimately that you then come down to a basis of either kind of intuition based common sense philosophy or just throw out the whole discipline entirely. You have to pick some axioms that are unsupported, and then you can build from there. But
yes, but why? Yes, but from a philosophical point of view, why would you do that? And that in itself becomes a philosophical question. Are you doing it purely out of utility? Why are you assigning value to these things? Does value necessarily imply that there is truth behind something? That's the infuriating thing about philosophy, is that going through these arguments and then reducing them to sort of core principles, you can, argue yourself in circles to the point that you actually have to make a declarative statement, which isn't necessarily found in pure logic, such as, say, for example, the existence of some sort of positive reality which supersedes a form of extreme skepticism, which basically says that everything beyond our consciousness can essentially have no value intrinsic in and of itself. And this, of course, would be confronted by something like Genesis, when you have not only did God create the world, but it was good that he created the world. There is good inherent in that creation and things like that. Again, that's a positive statement, but philosophically, one would contrast that with extreme nihilism. And I mean, it's interesting to sort of consider materialism. That's why I went for this question. But obviously, these are just sort of my my rambling sort of thoughts. So I can obviously go away and think about that and apply something sort of more coherent to it. But
yeah, well,
that's really all I
allowed
can
within the
say.
Gauntlet. Have
Unfortunately,
you thought at all about the interaction between our brains and our conscious experience? Because I mean, I think I added this. This is one of my favorite things to ponder over this. So I'm glad you chose this very deep and mysterious topic to discuss. But there's something strange, isn't there, about the fact that you could have a brain injury and then your personality changes, or you could take drugs that affect your experience of consciousness, and it seems to it seems like there is this strange two-way connection between a spiritual realm and a material realm. Maybe as a programmer, I think of it as like, what's the API? how do these two things connect such that, I mean, as a Christian, we believe that there is some thread of continuity that can exist and continue to exist without a physical body. That there's something out there that can be me, that can exist after I've died, and yet whenever I fall asleep, as far as I know, I lose any kind of consciousness. So have you got any thoughts on that?
well, I mean, you don't necessarily, you don't lose your consciousness when you're asleep. You sort of revert to a subconscious state, and you're not as aware of your surroundings as you would be otherwise. But I mean, neurology, obviously, I'm not qualified to talk about neurology at all, but it does pose an
Mm.
interesting question in terms of the most intimate association between the material and the conscious. And indeed, I think neurology essentially will be the final frontier when it comes to science in terms of being able to unpack the specific nature of consciousness. I mean, it'll endeavor to do so. I can't make any sort of declarative notion about that. And also, that may be the greatest sort of asset, or indeed, perhaps possibly the greatest claim against the idea of the true sort of nature of the individual, or
Mm.
some sort of belief structure or anything like that. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see how that sort of transpires over the next 100 years. I don't know how I can. Yeah.
I kind of think there's a limit on how much useful philosophical data can be gathered either by
Oh,
you.
these aren't philosophical questions. These would be purely sort of biological questions as to
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
the proper functioning. I mean, you brought up the whole notion of
Yes.
sensory influences being affected by stimuli such as drugs, and you mentioned the
Mm.
fact that you can have a lobotomy, and your entire sort of perception of the world and your entire personality can change as if there is a sense of consciousness which is bound up in the idea of identity or individuality. Is there something innate which transcends the brain, or are
Mm.
these simply the results of material factors? Again, it's fascinating, but I'm not sure, and I can't predict where the study of this field is going to go. I don't really think anyone can, even the people studying it. It's probably especially the people studying it.
No. Right, let's close out that round. I'm going to give you a 7, which is because I greatly enjoyed the conversation, and I mean, I already agreed with the statement, so I can't give you points for changing my mind. But I thought you brought a lot of interesting ideas to the table. Uh, Round 3: cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology.
I mean, we've already gone over metaphysics, so I'm going to avoid epistemology like the plague. I'm having subverted everyone and not chosen history in the second round. I think I'm going to play it safe in this round and go for world affairs.
This is your chance to play into your usual specialty. Um, the most important things cannot be measured. That does not sound like a world
No,
affairs
that
question. I think
sounds
that's
like a
been
metaphysical
miscategorized.
question. Yeah.
All right, I'll have to go and fix that at some point. Well, we've got the world is entering a new Cold War era, but I do think the other two questions must have accidentally slipped through. So, do you want me to give me a second? I'll dive in. I'll dive into my
I mean, I don't mind
notes.
answering the third one if
All
that's all
right,
right. Just
that
to make
that
things
simplifies
simpler.
things for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I appreciate that.
The world is entering a new Cold War. Well, the old Cold War was predicated around, principally, it was predicated around two opposing international power structures, that being the Soviet Union and the United States primarily. This is the idea of a bipolar international order. You have the quote unquote First World, which are the
Mm,
United States and her advanced allies. Then you have the Soviet Union and the Second World, her quote unquote allies, such as the Warsaw Pact countries. And then you have the Third World, which is everyone else of any sort of tremendous ideological stripe, going, say, for example, from the extremes of I don't know. Let's go to Argentina to Maoist China or something like that. But so that's one aspect to it, which is bipolarity. There's also an element of some sort of ideological clash associated with it. I don't believe in sort of monolithic ideological superstructures opposing each other, as a lot of people seem to reduce when it comes to the Cold War, albeit that's clearly an aspect to it, i.e., in the case of the Cold War, that would be uh, a specific definition of Marxism Leninism. And with the West, it's far more nebulous, but you can say you can apply it to notions such as democracy, freedom, whatever that means. It tends to be reduced also in terms of economic structures. So this would be capitalism versus socialism. So taking all of those threads and applying it to what we have now, well, after the 1980s, moving into the 1990s, people like Francis Fukuyama essentially believed we were moving into a unipolar world where we're moving beyond these sort of rigid, combative international structures. And we had essentially come to an understanding that the United States is the leading power in the world, and that ideologically we are all going to adopt liberal democracy, and essentially that will be the end of history. That will be the cutter point. Ideologically, economically, and militarily, the struggle has been won, and it will be simply a matter of consolidating that process into perpetuity. There will be no sort of great emergent threat to combat that, and of course that was completely wrong. One can say whether, this is a fundamental aspect when it comes to liberalism et al., whether the current sort of turn away from the outward appearance of justice, liberty, and democracy was always going to cannibalize itself and become as censorious and authoritarian as it has. But so obviously there is an aspect of ideological betrayal in terms of the victors of that original Cold War. But let's assume, therefore, we've moved beyond liberal democracy, and the mantra now is very much diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is there a ideological superstructure which opposes that? Well, not explicitly, perhaps in the way that you would think, but very much there are nations around the world who are pushing back against that notion, and some are pushing further back against that notion than others. So say, for example, Russia. Russia is going out of its way to take, say, for example, LGBTQ, whatever, and try to eliminate it from the body politic, eliminate foreign NGOs who may try to perpetuate that ideology. China, despite being formerly communist, is also appealing to this notion of socialism with Chinese characteristics, which you can basically say is a more refined version of Stalinism. National communism, but with none of the severe sort of economic restrictions and state-controlled economy, which seriously hampered the Soviet economy right into the sort of 1970s and 1980s. So clearly there is an ideological division being formed around the world between the old First World, which has now embraced diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the former great power, Russia, adopting something which is based more on Russian history, and that also been the case with China as well. I think what differentiates the previous Cold War to this one is that it's not exactly clear if this is a bifurcation or this is moving us from a unipolar world into a multipolar world where there are major great power competitors, the United States, not just simply emanating from one power. The most obvious example would be the fact that Russia is a great power, China is a great power, yet the relationship between those powers isn't necessarily that of total equality, nor is it that of the superiority of one power necessarily over the other. The relationship is symbiotic. But that's also to say that China and Russia don't have the monopoly in terms of competitors to the United States. There are other nations such as India. Of course, there is also Brazil. You can even say nations which are almost entirely overlooked in terms of great power now, such as Indonesia, which is coming up and will be one of the largest economies predicted in a very short amount of time. It's not necessarily that clear cut in terms of a good versus evil ideological struggle which is emerging here. But if we're going to look at this simply as diversity, equity, and inclusion, i.e., being globalist, transnationalist, and also pegged to this idea of climate change, the opposing power structure would be that of some sort of rootedness in history. And then you can extend whatever economic system or social system to facilitate that notion, a implicit rejection of the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a tentative sort of acknowledgement of quote unquote climate change, but not to the extent that it becomes an ideological pillar. So in that sense, yes, there are many similarities between what's going on in the Cold War, and it should be obvious to everyone that we have moved beyond the dominance of the United States. When we look at aspects such as de-dollarization, the Americans no longer essentially being the the arbiters of essentially what is meant by the rules-based international order. The fact that we don't know whether the dollar will be used as the major sort of subsidiary currency in terms of trading relations and things like that. All of these factors would indicate that we're moving away from the unipolar sort of happy-go-lucky world order that seemed emergent in the 1990s, and we're entering something far more unstable. And the situation in Ukraine is basically going to determine how unstable that relationship is, whether this is going to turn into a hot conflict as opposed to simply a simmering competition between economic blocks, military buildup, and ideology. I don't believe that this is going to end up in World War III, but the main difference between what's going on now and the Cold War is that our leaders seem to be far more unhinged than the leaders that were around in the Cold War. So that's the great wild card here. Is someone actually going to say, "Oh, we need a tactical preemptive nuclear strike against Russia," rather than admit that we've lost in Ukraine or something? Things I can't predict. Things I would say would be absolutely insane 2 years ago, but now I'm not so sure. So that would be the main criteria. Not that we've entered a situation where there is a new ideological and great power contest like the Cold War, but whether that will remain a Cold War or it'll become a hot war. Because, like I said, we are burying conventions which would determine the outlook of sane countries, and we've entered into the period of doom-driven insanity. But there we are.
I was listening to Stephen Kotkin talking about the Soviet leaders and how they in some ways really were true believers in Marxism. And it struck me that in a way there was a period where Russia was taken over by quite ideological and slightly unhinged leaders, and the West actually was reacting to that and didn't buy its own. The leaders didn't buy their own propaganda so much, and that now we may be in the opposite situation where, I mean, I don't think Putin is enormously ideological. He's just against the crazy ideology that's taking over the West. So is there a almost reverse? There's a way in which if we're entering a new Cold War, it's happening in the opposite direction.
I don't believe that leaders in the West were operating with that much more sort of pragmatism vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Stalin was very predictable in terms of representing some sort of return to form when it came to Tsarist foreign policy. The United States, by extension, was far more unpredictable, far more bellicose, and willing to screw over its allies to the same propensity, essentially, that the Soviet Union did. But the Soviet Union didn't really have allies. The Soviet Union had vassals. When it comes to ideology, I would actually point to someone like Gorbachev. I've focused on this quite extensively as to why the Soviet Union collapsed. And the idealism underpinning Gorbachev was that the Soviet Union could be a viable asset in a post-Cold War competitive, combative order, where essentially the Soviet Union would be able to break the US empire apart through the use of soft power. That seems almost completely ludicrous to us, especially given Gorbachev's limited understanding of economics and the ability of the Soviet Union to do that. But I'm completely convinced that is what Gorbachev essentially wanted to achieve. So if we're looking at competitive and ideological, then Gorbachev is very much the antithesis of what's going on in the West today, whereby we are using any means at our disposal in terms of being able to destroy a competing power structure. I can't really think of any Soviet leader, maybe Khrushchev at certain points, but I can't think of a Soviet parallel to the sort of rabid insanity which is going on at the moment. And I do seriously mean that, sort of going through the annals. I would have to look before the Cold War, and I would have to look at someone like Leon Trotsky, or the Spartacists, Rosa Luxemburg, Carl Eisner, all of these other figures emerging in the 1920s, to be able to find some sort of ideological zeal which would correlate with what's going on at the moment. The most terrifying thing is, though, that Leon Trotsky in the 1920s wasn't nearly as powerful as, say, the Biden administration is today, which is why I believe the question is not whether we're entering a new Cold War, rather we have entered it, and the question has now become, is that going to become a hot war?
Well, I wish that I could just keep talking about this topic for the next hour, but the format of the show insists that I have to bring the round to an end. But I will give you 12 points, which is a record high scoring round, because I don't limit myself to 10. And unsurprisingly, your contribution to that question was superlative.
It was interesting, actually, you coming up with 12. The first thing I thought in 12 is that the scoring convention might have been far sort of more ambitious than I was led to believe, maybe out of 20. And so I was scoring what would it be? 35% in the previous
getting a failing grade. No, it's a completely arbitrary scoring system where I've given myself scope to over the course, if I run this year after year, and I'm imagining that we'll look back on the first year and laugh at how low the scores were. Next round: psychology, elite theory, theology. Which do you fancy?
Well, I mean, we've sort of gone over aspects of theology, so I think maybe, and weirdly enough, I think psychology to some sort of minor degree. So I think maybe go on to elite theory.
Fancy some elite theory. Here are the 3 assertions that you can choose from. Populism is a delusion. The education system is designed to reproduce elite dominance, or elite rule is an inevitable feature of an organized society.
I think the third one is the most sort of obvious and the most mundane, so I'm not going to go for that one. Sorry.
Sure, no worries. Can you still read the others?
Yes, I can still read the others. So I'll probably go on to is populism a delusion?
Yes.
It's an interesting question, because my definition of populism would be a political appeal by an elite to what would be considered the on-the-ground issues pertaining to a certain group. And in that sense, you can say it is actually a fundamental component of elite theory, because populism does not imply to me that it is a result of, you can say, an actual sort of hold of the population over the political system, but rather it's simply a political tactic to be able to circumvent a group of counter-elites by appealing below them directly to their constituents and their immediate needs. So take, say, for example, in this country, if I were to conjure up a hypothetical, 80% of normal people are questioning immigration. The extremes to which we are going, beyond 1 million people a year being allowed into this country with seemingly reduced checks every single year. And we have now sort of had statistical sort of proof that the economic benefits from immigration have been a lie, that immigration is costing us significantly more than it brings into the economy. However, the quote unquote elite rule that we have in this country is almost universally opposed to any sort of breaks on the road of mass immigration. Perhaps the best one can get in the election that's coming up is maybe reducing 1.3 million people coming over a year to 1.1 million people coming over a year. Perhaps that's the most that will be permitted in terms of a mitigation of that factor. So populism to me would be a counter-elite figure. Take, for example, a Nigel Farage, taking over the inept sort of control of the Reform Party by Tice and appealing directly to the people on a platform of reducing immigration. And in terms of like a populist vent, I think an aspect of populism isn't appealing to a wide range of policy issues. Seldom are elections essentially held on policy issues at all. Maybe a couple of upper middle class people will vote simply based on policy issues, but ultimately it comes either down to things like Gibbs personality or sort of in-group preference, or indeed the attempt to sort of identify oneself in opposition to another, i.e. very basic elements of political survival. So in the case of a populist candidacy like Farage, appealing to something like immigration and only immigration, I think would be the sort of the rubric in terms of being able to understand what a populist cause is. In that sense, you can't say populism is delusion, can you? It's a viable political formula. Um, within the sort of concept of elite theory, I think the contention wouldn't be, is populism a delusion? Is populism popular? And I don't mean popular in the sense that it has political approval. I mean popular in the sense that it is democratic. It is of the people, rather than simply being a means to mobilize the population to support a particular candidate. And the emphasis I would put here, that populism is crafting a constituency. It is not empowering people. It is simply using the supposed concerns of people in terms of being able to buttress a new regime. So I come up with one potential example that can happen in the election. I don't think it's going to happen, by the way, but let's take that as one scenario. Historically, even coming up with the origin of the word populism, I think a very sort of strong contender for the etymology actually comes from the elite conflict within the Roman Empire, when it transitioned from the Roman Republic until the Roman Empire, which were the populares versus the optimates. I mean, you can obviously assume which faction is which just from the names alone. But Julius Caesar, as head of the populares, appealed to the, you can say, the jingoistic and prideful aspect of Roman culture by becoming a war hero, by becoming a conqueror, by acquiring a new vast series of territories for the Roman Empire, but in so doing, essentially of his own volition, beyond any sort of official oversight over what he was doing. He was staking a claim against the authority of the Roman Senate. So despite having massive popular approval to what he was doing, when he crossed the Rubicon, he essentially had the question, do I do so disarmed, or do I do so at the head of the army? The population in Rome received him like a hero, but the Roman Senate fled, and this started a war between the Senate and the populares, the faction led by Julius Caesar. So populism is not a delusion at all. Populism is a political formula. But the question is, perhaps, if we're going to look into the idea of populism, is populism a delusion? Is it an enduring idea, populism, or is it simply the result of a quick political formula, bring someone in power, and eventually they will go on to betray their constituents or whatever? Even if that's the case, even if we can say that populism is somewhat ephemeral, that it can bring someone into power, it creates a new political order, it can result in a rotation of elites, that in itself is a core political philosophy. It can be actualized, as we can see, and I believe it will be. There's a continual, and always there will be a continuous prospect of some sort of populist revolt. But notice, it's not really a popular revolt; it is a populist revolt. It is someone appealing to the needs directly of the people by circumventing a intermediary set of elites that would perhaps forestall that. So no, I don't believe there's any case that could be made that populism is a delusion, unless you take all the terms that I've thrown at you just now and completely redefine them, in which case that wouldn't really be fair, would it?
I would never do such a thing. If there is no there's no power amongst the masses, that all power is held in a few small organized groups, as elite theory would lead us to believe. Where does populism get its power as a political formula?
Because populism is essentially a tool of organizing political power around a expanded constituency. So that's all political formulas have constituents. So let's take I don't know, the Democratic Party in the United States. The Democratic Party likes to think of African Americans as a constituency, and it likes to appeal directly to them as a voting bloc. Do we therefore say the Democratic Party are populists? We can say in some sort of roundabout way they are, but they're selectively populist in terms of appealing to one group and then saying something completely different to another. I mean, look at George Galloway. Recently, you can say that this is another case where he is populist in the sense that he's appealing to the Muslim sentiments regarding Gaza, but he's also a populist in the other sense of appealing to the frustrated anti-globalist sentiments of the white working class. So yes, you can say that all it is essentially is a means of activating a political constituency with which you then rely on them in terms of being able to bring you power. Obviously, individuals can act as some sort of they have to act as some sort of equation when it comes to power. We're talking about foot soldiers that are going off to fight your wars. You're talking about people who are going to staff your administration. They're going to be people that have to acquiesce in the fact that you've taken control. Um, you know, elite theory doesn't preclude the idea that the individual has potential, essentially. It's simply a matter of to what extent political societies are essentially inverted, to the extent that politicians take their cue from the people rather than the other way around. What populism does, essentially, it's not the people being able to impose a quote unquote belief system or whatever on a elite individual. Rather, it is an elite individual being able to identify what the populist concern is back to the people themselves. It is a form of political identification and being able to find out essentially what a winning formula is in terms of being able to activate that class of support. But that, of course, relies on charismatic leadership. The idea that the people will be able to collectively come to an understanding of what their ultimate interest is, as a result of some sort of act of supreme spontaneity, I think is completely ridiculous. But that's very much Rousseauian in terms of this idea that there is a indomitable manifested will in terms of what the popular will is. But as we saw with the French Revolution, with the most hardcore Rousseauian of all, Maximilien Robespierre, it wasn't a simple matter that he was a representative of the popular will, but he identified his own goals with the popular will. So in that sense, again, he was a populist. And like any populist, he would take a lofty idealism relating to the so-called notion of the Rousseauian popular will, and he would combine it with a policy regarding the price of bread to ensure that people in Paris wouldn't revolt against him, even if that essentially meant starving people outside Paris and confiscating bread at the end of a bayonet in terms of being able to pay off your political supporters. So, like I said, just to make this very simple, it's about a elite being able to capture a broad constituency by appealing directly to them on some sort of policy level, which is being overlooked by a intermediary or opposing series of elites.
Wasn't it Lenin who used to say bread, peace, and land when he was speaking on the streets?
Yes, that was the promise. That was the promise of the of the Bolsheviks, and of course, all he had to do, because of course he was a genius. All he had to do was promise peace and bread, peace primarily to the army, and bread to the people in St. Petersburg. And of course, he brought neither. But it didn't matter at that point because he was at the head of an organized government that could go around and determine essentially what the future was going to be without recourse to broad popular sentiments, because they now lived in a state of abject control and fear, which didn't exist in the febrile situation of 1917 in Petrograd. But there we are.
That's kind of an example of the quintessential organized minority, the Bolsheviks, using populism as one tool in their toolbox.
Exactly, or like George Galloway appealing to both sides of the populist coin to invert something that our beloved Prime Minister said recently.
Well, I'm giving you 11 for that round. It was It was, again, excellent work, and brings us to round 5. Slightly behind schedule, but that's all right. It shows I'm enjoying myself. For this round, would you like technology, natural sciences, or Christology?
I think I'll try and be brief, I think, in this topic. And as we're talking about dogma, I think I can be very brief when it comes to Christology. So
All right.
let's talk about that.
Here are your 3 options. Jesus' message was about social justice, poverty, and inequality. Jesus is fully God and fully man. Or Jesus' life shows us how to suffer.
I'm going to go for the second one, even though the third one is probably more interesting, and the first one will probably take me hours to be able to argue. Even though
So
maybe it may be beneficial for a
speed.
couple, it may be beneficial for a few socialists and atheists who continue to tell you what Christ would essentially want of us. But Jesus is fully God and fully man.
Well, you'll have to come back on Lambda Bible Studies sometime and talk about those other 2.
I only point this out because it actually gives me ability to shill a stream, not a stream, a video I did a long time ago, actually, where I was talking about the myriad schisms during the first ecumenical councils of the church, and they revolved around several issues concerning the specific nature of Christ. Of course, within a Trinitarian conception, Christ is part of the 3 aspects of God, the other one being the Father and the other one being the Holy Spirit. We have theories such as Arius, a theoretician such as Arius coming down and saying that Christ was not God in the sense that he had full equality with the Father and the Holy Spirit. And this caused a major sort of theological schism throughout the world after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But even after that, even after Arius was extricated from the sort of religious sort of from the church, you were still left with many other sort of competing theories about the true nature of Christ. And as far as I can remember them, one is monophysitism, another is miaphysitism, and the view which is essentially compounded by this theory is diaphysitism, the idea that Jesus is fully God and fully man. The opposing views, essentially, I can't quite remember the intricacies of miaphysitism because there's actually quite a lot of nuance pertaining to that view. But I do believe it is the view held by the Oriental Orthodox. So this would be the inheritors of the quote-unquote Alexandria school of theology. Saint Cyril. So these would be the Armenian churches, the Ethiopian churches. But the Chalcedonian definition is that Jesus is fully God and fully man. And in terms of ending that video, I was thinking of a way to sort of round it out in terms of bringing us to an understanding of these sort of very specific, and I was think to an outsider looking at this, they would say, why does it matter? What does it matter if Jesus is fully God? What does it matter if Jesus is only God? And I'm reminded of that amazing icon of Christ Pantocrator, where the human side of his face is shown, and then the face of God is also shown. There are 2 distinct natures within Christ. One is the Father, and one is human. I don't know who is the creator of that icon, but it's always left quite an impression on me. And in terms of being able to identify this and reconcile this, I'm reminded of the agony of the garden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, how the human aspect of Christ is coming to understand essentially what is then essentially the determined outcome, that he has been betrayed and he is now going to face his crucifixion. So the human Christ is filled with all of the emotions and the trepidation which would encounter anyone in terms of being able to sacrifice oneself. But if Christ was only human, coming to the crucifixion, then what does it essentially mean that Christ as a man would sacrifice himself, rather than the crucifixion being associated with God himself sacrificing ourselves to redeem the original sin which had been created by Adam and Eve, and thereby essentially allowing us all a means, not only in terms of being able to atone for sin, but to appeal to the resurrection and come into a perfect understanding with God. I think in terms of looking at that, I'm convinced of diaphysitism, that Christ has two natures, and one is fully God and fully man. But like I said, that's a very complicated question. Like I said, there are thousands of years of sort of theological intrigue pertaining to that. But in terms of being able to sort of find a way of sort of justifying it to myself without just recourse to summing up other theologians, I always thought that the agony and the crucifixion was perhaps the best way to look at it.
Yes, and there's the question of, can God change? The Passion of the Christ implies that, as I understand it, that there was some change in Christ that would not be theologically possible for God to undergo. Is that, am I remembering that correctly?
Well, again, we can go into this in real depth, but like I said, if it was purely God, then you wouldn't essentially be able to understand when Christ says, is it Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? If he was purely God, this would be completely nonsensical. But as fully God and fully man, as two distinct natures inhabited in one figure, the Christ, I think there can be reconciliation between the two possible and contradictory extremes of that position.
Well, I'm giving you another 11 for bringing in so many pertinent and interesting aspects in your answer, and that brings us to the final round. Whoa! Wait a second. I accidentally clicked next round twice, and it's showing us the high scores, but that's not correct because you haven't done one of the rounds. Right. This will take me just 30 seconds to... You know what I'm currently doing is I'm in the back end typing in a field in JSON directly. There we go. It works. Can you believe it? Right, last round. Literature, software and mathematics, or eschatology?
Considering this is the end of the round, I think eschatology seems quite appropriate.
Good choice. Okay. There is no afterlife. God interacts with humanity differently at different periods, or the Book of Revelation should be interpreted allegorically.
I think I'll go with God interacts with humanity differently at different periods. Obviously, I think a lot of people can take that argument and they can look to the example of the Old Testament God and the New Testament God and look at how God, say, for example, treated with the Jews, was involved in the original flood, which was rescued by the Ark and Noah, invited the plagues upon Egypt, all of these various and complicated and direct responses, and the most controversial response being essentially when God sent the angel of death to kill the firstborn of every sort of denizen in Egypt. Contrast that with how a theologian is able to sort of justify what's going on today, and the fact that God no longer directly interacts with us in the sense that you can directly sort of attribute this to his wrath or whatever, when you can say, for example, Sodom and Gomorrah would be quite an apt comparison in terms of being able to understand where we are and what essentially was the situation in the Bible. So in terms of scripture, there is the precedent where one can look to the Old Testament God, and especially the God of Genesis and Exodus, and essentially everything that's attributed originally to Moses, and be able to reconcile this with what's going on today. So that's an argument which can pertain to this from Scripture. Another aspect, which is meta within the whole context, is that if we adopt the Trinitarian perspective of Christ, obviously Christ is consubstantial. He existed at the beginning of time, yet he becomes the Christ, fully man and fully human, in terms of the incarnate, at the progression from the Old Testament into the New Testament. So if we're looking at God interacting directly with us, then God has essentially assumed for us a completely different form in terms of the Christ, the anointed, in terms of how he interacts with the Jews, how he interacts with the Pharisees, how he undertakes his ministry. All of these things which contrast directly with the Father, with the Holy Spirit, and how they interacted in the course of the Old Testament. And indeed, if you look at, again, I'm sure I'm getting a lot of this wrong because I'm just going off memory here, but again, if we look at something like the Epiphany, and then we look at the ascension of Christ, and we have the descent of the Holy Spirit as representative of the flame, then God himself, in many of his aspects, assumes a different sort of purpose and meaning from the Old Testament in terms of the New Testament. And of course, this can be related basically to the idea of a covenant, the covenant that God holds with the people. So you can say that the first covenant between man and God was essentially the covenant that defined the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. But of course, what did Adam and Eve do? They broke that covenant. So that was representative by them being cast out of the garden. That is one way of God interacting with us in a primordial, paradisical form, of course, but we are destroying essentially that creation. And you can say the logical endpoint of that is after Cain and Abel, we have the great flood, we have the ark, and then we have the new creation of humanity stemming from the ark, which is represented by the new covenant, symbolized by the dove and the rainbow. And of course, moving from that, we have the story of Exodus, etc. But after the creation of the state of Judea, the state of Israel, despite the sort of hero kingship of David, the kingdom of Israel itself undergoes a serious decline, and not sort of quite as obvious as that in terms of the Garden of Eden, but it can be associated with the life of Solomon himself. And so how does God interact with this process? By sending us the prophets, by sending us, say, for example, Elijah, coming down and being able to warn us, essentially, about the apostasy when Ahab and Jezebel essentially turn the religion of Israel to the religion of Baal and things like that. So the coming of Christ and how God interacts with us essentially is through the revelations, through the prophets. And then, of course, like I said, we arrive at the Christ. So it should be obvious just by looking at Scripture, and if we're looking at the Christian God, then all of these things represent God interacting with us at various stages of our decline. And these are representative by a period of essentially a new covenant, a broken covenant, a restoration, and a means of essentially achieving some sort of resurrection in terms of our understanding with God. But also this leads to an interesting sort of historical question relating to how do we perceive God in events, especially after after we depart from the New Testament and after we depart from the letters and the original Gospels. And just looking at what's going on now and looking at the case in Scripture, that in itself is a identifier as to how God interacts differently compared to all of these other populations that we see. And of course, I can take this and become ecumenical and say, do we simply mean the Christian God? You know, how do how do all the sort of polytheistic conceptions of God, just moving beyond that? I mean, obviously we're talking about eschatology within a strict Christian sense, but you know, how, say, for example, does God interact with a population that has no experience, say, for example, of of missionary activity or anything like that. How does God interact with that? So, and it's not just different places. Obviously, it's different people. You know, how is it, say, for example, that a missionary progress, say, for example, changes from one area to another? Um, you can say God's ministry and Christ's ministry is as diverse as the peoples themselves with which they encounter at various times, which is in itself a whole part of being able to understand a relationship between God and the wider world, in terms of God in many forms and many manifestations, interacting with many peoples at many times, of many languages and many places. So I don't really see how you can argue against that and say that God is a monolith and say there is only one way of interacting. Because essentially that approach would take us back to the Tower of Babel. And you can say the justification for God's different interaction and this process of, you can say, decline, the covenant, and a distinct manifestation and interaction was deliberately forsaken by God when he took the Tower of Babel, which was essentially an attempt to reach God and establish a dominion under God where everyone spoke the same language. And what does God do? He destroys it, and he creates the pluralistic nature of the world, and such is essentially a representation of how God interacts with us.
Do you have a position with respect to dispensationalism?
I'm not entirely particularly familiar with that term. Do you want to define it quickly?
Yeah, so I think this is a whole school of thought that breaks up history into, depending on which group you're talking to, maybe 7 periods, and says that God had a particular. I think in particular, it's like, this is the way you are saved if you're alive during this period. So, for example, there's a big difference between the time where God was dealing with Israel and then the time when God was dealing with the church, in opposition to more of a covenantal theology, where in a way the church is seen as a continuation of Israel, and it's actually God dealing with mankind in the same way. It's just that it's opened up. So one view is seeing time divided up clearly into periods. I think the other place that this causes disagreements is in interpretation of prophecy. So people who are dispensationalist tend to have quite a lot of quite specific interpretations of, for example, bits of Old Testament prophecies, and say these are prophecies about a specific dispensation that is yet to appear. So then non-dispensational interpretations tend to be more broad in their interpretation to prophecy, and seeing things as applying more pictorially, I guess. So I guess based on my my brief and slightly hand-waving description, do you have a feeling for which side of that divide you would tend to fall on?
I mean, I'll have to sort of go away and
Yeah, sure.
to define these things very precisely, because just looking at it on sort of Wikipedia now, it seems to be a 20th century American sort of theology, and like I said, I'm not
Yeah,
particularly familiar with it, but
sure.
I mean, I'll just go back to my broader points about sort of relating to Scripture, relating back
Yeah.
to the whole idea of a covenant. I mean, coming back to history, I mean, as we see all of this relating to the idea of definitive epochs, which perhaps be an appropriate way of looking at this, the whole sort of particular conception of God interacting with a time period is not just sort of the legacy of theology, it's also the legacy of how we even look at history. Yes, most historians aren't going to even say that God interacts with us directly, but even in terms of the manifestation of how we identify our own sense of time, all of these things occur differently. So yes, I think all of this does is, regardless of a theological perspective or a historical perspective, it all pertains to a sense of particularity as opposed
Mm.
to universalism in the interaction, if I'm going to distill this
Mm.
argument.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to give you a 9 for that round, and that brings us to the score table. But I think I need to refresh it because I may have broken. There you go. You're tied with Ed Dutton.
Oh, good.
Because of pressing my buttons in the wrong order, you appeared briefly in the wrong place in the score table. But as you can see, you got an incredible score of 58 in total. And the reign of quantity continues as I turn pleasant conversation into something score-worthy.
I'm just trying to think. It was what was it? It was metaphysics. Metaphysics was my greatest
Your
failing.
downfall.
I have to focus on my weakest point, and I need to strengthen that, I think.
If you're going to come back next year, to stay competitive, because of course all the competitors are going to go away and lick their wounds and learn lessons. So so you're gonna have to spend the year thinking of nothing else but metaphysics.
I mean, it is rather depressing, because I would have thought that I had a better grasp of metaphysics compared to economics, but I learn something new about myself every day.
We've all been poisoned by listening to too much of Academic Agent, and we've accidentally become economic buffs.
Yes, I'm relaying far too much misapprehensions and misquotations of Austrian economics. Go back it all begins with Mises. I'd like to thank Mises for giving me a more profound understanding of economics vis-a-vis metaphysics. So more Plato and less Mises. All right.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
And it's been